Well, we have finally reached the time that seems like the appropriate or best time to address this topic. So, we're going to be addressing the topic of the psychopathic personality. For those of you who are not familiar with psychopathy, psychopathic personality is essentially a personality construct that involves intraspecies predation. There are some common features associated with psychopathy or red flags, and essentially, psychopathy involves a constellation of manifestations. You might see dynamics such as egocenteredness or narcissism, extreme narcissism, arrogance. There might be, or there's a tendency for there to be affective disturbances. And so there may be emotions, but there may be difficulties with expressing the emotions or knowing exactly how to express the emotions. But often the emotions are simply not there. And so there are problems with both the emotions and the expressions of such. And so often there is a sense of apathy. There is impaired emotional empathy. There is a general coldness or callousness and often behavioral disinhibition. Now, the disinhibition may not always be readily apparent, but it is prevalent. There is also a pattern of impulsiveness, definitely superficial charm. Okay. Individuals tend to be very parasitic, and there is a proneness to deceitfulness, um, pathological lying or compulsive lying, repetitive lying. There are dynamics of manipulation that are featured in relationships with individuals with psychopathic personalities, and also a tendency towards criminality. Generally speaking, there is low or no remorse or guilt for wrongdoing. And the individuals who experience psychopathic personality or operate in that manner, they also tend to have immunity to many forms of stress or just the experiences of stress. So we're going to look at some general factors related to psychopathy. We're going to look at some psychological dynamics, some philosophical dynamics related to psychopathy, and theology. We're also going to look at, this is just an introductory discussion, we're also going to look at an example of a historic figure who espouses or espoused a life philosophy that involved features of psychopathy. Now, we are not focusing on how to help individuals with psychopathy or how you can help heal them or have a better relationship with them. The information and the discussions are simply to provide insight for your edification. And we're going to start off with getting to what I believe is the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter appears to be an experience of craving growing out of a sense of void. And so this turns into an excessive self-focus and a pulling into the self from the external world. So let's start with breaking down this term psychopathy. Psychopathy means essentially psychological suffering. And so you have the psycho and then the pathy, which is related to the term pathos, which means suffering. Now, some individuals might offer that when people are dealing with or operating in psychopathy, that they do not suffer. That may or may not be true depending on the individual. However, what is noted is that individuals who are experiencing individuals with psychopathy, those individuals do tend to suffer. And so family members, friends, various individuals in relationships, co-workers, subordinates, supervisors, um, neighbors. Those individuals do have a tendency to suffer based upon engagement with the individual who is operating in a psychopathic manner. And so now let's start with the heart of the matter. We're going to start off with addressing what appears to be the general philosophy of individuals who are operating in a psychopathic manner. And it ties to the historic figure that we're going to touch on. And so the general philosophy, whether it's conscious or unconscious, with individuals operating in a psychopathic manner, is this idea of do as thou wilt. In other words, do whatever you want to do. Now that we have that general philosophy understood, let's turn our attention to the origin of psychopathy. First of all, there is no clear-cut consensus about whether psychopathy is nature or nurture or some combination of the two. But there is evidence to support both nature and nurture, strong evidence to support nature. That may be then exacerbated by nurture. What we do see is that with respect to psychopathy, there are manifestations in childhood, very early childhood. But there is no single cause noted so far with respect to what brings this on. What has been noted, however, is a dynamic known as arrested development. And so with respect to the way that individuals with psychopathy operate in the world, it's as if there is persistent juvenile functioning, hence that arrested development. And some people might even experience some individuals who are operating in a psychopathic manner as toddlers. And so in terms of the developmental space, toddlers seem to be most similar to some of the dynamics that some people see. There also might be significant manifestations of adolescent type behavior, and sometimes there are similarities between the 2-year-olds and the 15-year-olds. And sometimes you see that converging in this psychopathic functioning dynamic. Right now, we are just doing a very discrete overview. We will address a number of other issues related to psychopathy, but for now, we're going to keep it pretty discrete. But there are some important factors to consider, generally speaking. One is a cognitive functioning. And so there are some very specific dynamics related to cognitive functioning in psychopathy. What do we mean by cognitive functioning? We mean intellectual functioning, thinking, processing information. There are also important emotional factors to consider. There are definite behavioral manifestations. That's how we, for the most part, know what's going on with respect to psychopathy. It's the behavior that is seen, the behavior that is experienced. There are attitude issues with respect to psychopathy that we will address. There are also notably social factors, and so the way that the individuals operate in the world, the way they engage other people, the way they get along with people, those social factors. So we will consider those things. There are also notably biological factors, and specifically neurobiological factors that should be given even more serious consideration. And so that's that nature component. There have definitely been findings related to anatomy and physiology with respect to psychopathy. And finally, there are spiritual factors to consider. And I want to share this side note with you for consideration. Generally speaking, when individuals have psychopathy or they are operating in a psychopathic manner, often there are criminal activities. And one thing that happens in some situations when an individual is being prosecuted is that an individual can assert an insanity defense. And what's noteworthy about psychopathy is that it perfectly fits with an insanity defense. However, courts are not receptive to an insanity defense being asserted from someone who is experiencing psychopathy. However, this is something that probably needs to be reconsidered given some of the neurobiological research that has been done. Of course, what the courts may be struggling with is that this is a manifestation, this personality is a manifestation that has at its heart these interpersonal problems that involve predation and often involve criminality. And so, therefore, the courts are not predisposed to allowing someone to be considered not guilty by reason of insanity. But there is sufficient information that suggests that courts might need to revisit this. Okay, states need to revisit it. The nation might need to revisit it. And so here's a bit of information, a little excerpt from some research on cognitive neuroscience. And it indicates the brain regions implicated in psychopathy include the orbital frontal cortex, the insula, anterior and posterior cingulate, the amygdala, the parahippocampal gyrus, and the anterior superior temporal gyrus. Okay, so in other words, there's a lot going on with the brain in individuals who are experiencing psychopathy. And this is some pretty old research. This is from 2006. It has been going on for a while. One thing to also keep in mind is that psychopathy is not something that is diagnosed. Okay, and so an individual will not go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a medical doctor and leave with an official diagnosis of psychopathy. It's not something that is characterized in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's not there. And part of the reason why it's not there, according to narratives, is that there is difficulty with measuring the symptoms, some of the symptoms of psychopathy. That may or may not be the case, but that is generally what is offered. And so you're not going to find a medical or a psychological formal diagnosis of psychopathy, but there are some other disorders that are highly correlated with this symptom set that makes up psychopathy. And so we're going to look at some of them. This might be a good time to point out something. Some people are not aware that there are different specialties in psychology. Not all psychologists are created equal, and we don't all do the same things. And psychologists are not psychiatrists. Okay, so those are two totally different professions. It might seem like they are the same, but they are not the same. And then within psychology, there are different specialties. And with respect to psychopathy, various researchers might be involved in psychopathy research, but the individuals that would be dealing with individuals who might be manifesting psychopathy in terms of a helping role, those would be clinical psychologists or counseling psychologists for the most part. Now, with respect to some of the dynamics that are related to psychopathy, these involve a number of disorders, some of them in childhood, and one in particular is supposed to be a precursor to psychopathy. And so there are child and adolescent symptoms. Generally speaking, people don't turn 18 and suddenly start manifesting psychopathic symptoms. And so one disorder that is not often addressed is oppositional defiant disorder. And so there may be a pattern in childhood, in adolescence, of oppositional defiant disorder prior to these adult manifestations of psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. The other big one is conduct disorder. And conduct disorder involves misbehaving children, okay? And we can get into what that's all about in a separate conversation. But conduct disorder is the one that you tend to see in childhood and adolescence that serves as a foundation for antisocial personality disorder and then these psychopathic manifestations. Also, interestingly, and there is growing research related to this, is Asperger's. When Asperger's was first discovered, it was coined autistic psychopathy. And so we're going to look at some of the similarities and differences with respect to Asperger's and psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, and also narcissism. Then you have the personality disorders that tend to be related to psychopathy. One is antisocial personality disorder that we just discussed. The other one is borderline personality disorder, and then narcissistic personality disorder. We also need to address the topic of cure and treatment with respect to psychopathy. There is no cure that I have ever heard of. There is no treatment for psychopathic personality or psychopathic personality functioning or psychopathy. And if someone tells you that there is a cure, they are generally not telling the truth. They may be confused, they may be misguided, but what they are for certain is inaccurate at this point. And so there is nothing that has been found so far. And this includes clergy. And so if you ever have clergy indicate that they have healed or seen the healing of an individual with psychopathy, they are also either misguided or misleading. And so this is important to keep in mind. No cure and no treatment. And so therefore, we are not going to be having discussions about how you can help or how you can cure or mitigate anything related to psychopathic symptomatology or manifestations. And so what you need to do in terms of the information is figure out what you can do with the information that's going to be beneficial to you specifically. not in reference to treating someone or making someone else better with respect to psychopathic functioning. Now, back to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter, as I indicated before, appears to be a dynamic of void. And so, what appears to be going on is that the individuals have a sense of void or an experience of a chasm, or they operate as if there is a void and a chasm. And what you see growing out of this is incessant craving and coveting. And that coveting and craving is where that pulling things into the self tends to come from. What I mean by craving and coveting is the desire for things that are outside of the self, bringing them to the self. And in many ways, this bringing to the self can serve as a fill up. So it's like if someone's hungry and then they eat, then they are full. With respect to psychopathy, however, the craving, the coveting is incessant, and it appears to not readily be satisfied. And also, there is a high threshold in terms of stimulation and excitement. And so you might see young people who have conduct disorder, for instance, needing to do quite a bit in order to be sufficiently stimulated or excited about something. And so you might see these daredevil activities going on, taking all sorts of extreme risk, because there is that high threshold. Now we're going to continue with this discussion related to the coveting and the craving, but I want to just take a little sidetrack here and talk about Freud's drive theory. Now, Freud has a theory, he has several theories, or he had several theories, related to the anatomy of the personality, the structure of the human personality. And he envisioned it being in three components. And you've probably heard of these before. And so one is the id, another component is the ego, and the third component is the super ego. And so what we're going to focus on is the id, because the id seems to be the aspect of personality with respect to psychopathy that is the overarching component. It is the part of the personality that is the strongest with respect to psychopathic functioning. And so we're going to quickly look at what the id is all about. And then we're going to look at some of these theological constructs or treatments or discussions of this dynamic of craving or id functioning. Now, according to Freud, these three aspects of the personality, the id, the ego, and the superego, they are sort of like levels, and almost like looking at a mountain, and the superego would be at the top of the mountain, the ego would be in the middle, and the id would be at the base of the mountain. And so, with respect to Freud's theory, the id is supposed to be the part of the mind of an individual or the psyche of an individual that is devoted to innate instincts and base impulses. And so, with respect to Maslow's theory, that hierarchy of needs, The individual with respect to the id is at that base level, very similar to where individuals are with respect to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And needs are synonymous with impulses and instincts. And so, with respect to the id, Freud also offers that the id is in conflict with the part of the mind that is devoted to controlling these impulses and instincts. And that part is the ego primarily. And then subsequent to that, there is the development of the superego, the conscience. And if you recall, with individuals who are operating in a psychopathic manner, there is impaired guilt, there's impaired remorse. And so, therefore, with respect to Freud's theory, there is impaired superego functioning. And the superego is supposed to help moderate the id, moderate what's going on with respect to the ego, and allow a person to conform their behavior to the dictates of the law, at the very least. But with respect to psychopathic functioning and Freud's theory, the superego is impaired or not functioning at all. It is not developed or underdeveloped. There is also some suggestion that superego development depends on the relationship with the father. And so, if there is a father absence, there is perhaps, according to Freud's theory about superego, a higher than average risk for a young person not adequately developing the superego, not adequately developing conscience. Okay, so let's go over this id dynamic a little bit more. And so, with respect to the id, and this is that Freudian theory about the lower level needs, id is associated with the construct of libidinal urges. You've heard the term libido before. Well, that's what this is all about. And so there are physical factors associated with this, emotional factors, spiritual dynamics, and mental dynamics. But lust is at the heart of it. Okay? So that whole do as thou wilt, that is also about lust. That wilt part encompasses many things, and we're going to touch on some of those. Now, the lust with respect to the id and these libidinal urges, it's often a forbidden type of lust. There is also, with respect to the id, this dynamic of resolve. Freud referred to this theory as the drive theory because that's what's going on. It's the person's drive towards something, a person's determination to do something, one's inclination, one's will. And so that's what the id is about. It's about the will of an individual, the inclination, the resolve, the drive, and the determination. And this manifests in a variety of ways. Not all of libidinal energy is negative, by the way. And so this drive energy, or what Freud thought of as an energy theory, it's not all negative, okay? And so, again, there is this focus on these base types of needs. And with respect to the libido, there are aspects of the libido that involve care and love. Now, what some people don't understand is love is also a construct that is tied to this idea of will. In some ways, it's just an interchange. And so there are all sorts of instincts that are related to the id. And so, with respect to that void, that chasm, this is also a part of that. But the love or the absence of love is another part of it. And so, with respect to the id or this libidinal functioning, um, there are often problems associated with desire or inordinate desire for whatever it happens to be. It could be inordinate desire for candy, okay? Um, but there is this dynamic of longing. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, there is a dynamic of longing and a dynamic of pursuing things, that coveting that's going on. There's a passion about it. So there are some emotions going on, and essentially going right back to that construct of will. The libido is about the will, the determination, the drive, the longing. The id in and of itself is not a bad thing. Again, individuals have cravings, they have a desire for love, for care, for all of those things. They have a desire for physical things, material things, basic things. And generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what serves as the motivator for people. However, what's going on with respect to individuals who are operating in a psychopathic manner is they have a philosophy of do whatever they want to do to get whatever it is that they want to get. And this is coupled with no remorse and no guilt about how things are acquired. And so this is how you see that merging of the id, that will, with psychopathy. They are intertwined. And here we have some depictions of an individual who had as a philosophy this do as thou wilt. Um, and essentially, it wasn't just a philosophy, but it was basically a religion. And so this was a very defined belief system that many people picked up on. However, this philosophy, if you will, is the philosophy of psychopathy. This idea of doing whatever an individual wants to do, or that they have a desire to do, or a drive to do, or they love to do. That is the essence of this particular philosophy. And there are mentions of this dynamic in Scripture. And so we're just going to address a few of those also so that we pull this totally together here. What's noteworthy is how many constructs are tied to this idea of will or wilt. And so you see that with that construct of Thelema, but it's also embedded in the construct of Boule. And so there are a number of dynamics, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of them that tie into this whole idea of the will of a person, or the desire or the drive of a person. What is motivating a person? What's the inclination of the individual? So here we have this philosophy, this id philosophy essentially, that completely supports or serves as a foundation for perhaps Freud's drive theory related to the id. And so essentially what we have with this historic figure here and this philosophy is an id philosophy. And so the philosophy of the psychopathic individual, the individual who is operating in a psychopathic manner. It is an id philosophy. That is the focus. There is no focus on the superego, the conscience, and there is very little focus on the ego, that reality testing component to the personality. And so there is, again, that extreme focus on the void and the chasm and filling it by pulling towards the person, all manner of things. And again, with respect to this do as thou wilt, these two things go together perfectly. And so again, this is basically an id theory, and psychopathy is essentially, according to Freud's drive theory, an id functioning dynamic. One interesting thing about this quote that's coming from this historic figure is that the quote itself attempts to normalize psychopathy, essentially. And so the quote is, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will." Again, this is an attempt to normalize apparently how this person experiences the world, or how they see the world, or how they operate in the world. And so this is a very chasm oriented philosophy. It's a very void oriented philosophy. But what it also is an attempt to make this experience the normal one, and the experiences that other people are having, or the philosophies that other people are having about life and what is the whole of the law, those things are being made abnormal, while this is being presented as the normal state of affairs. This often happens with individuals who are operating from this framework. There is a belief, generally speaking, that other people, at the heart, at the core, are the same. And so there is a tendency to believe that underneath it all, everyone is a psychopath. Everyone is operating in this way under the surface. And here you can see with this quote, this philosophy, a reiteration of the same thing. And so you see this do what thou wilt, and shall be the whole of the law. Wilt and law are essentially interchangeable. Law and love are interchangeable. When you start getting down to the etymology foundations of these constructs, and then love and will are synonymous. And so there's just this repetition of this whole will thing here, this whole drive thing, this motivation, this desire. There is a reiteration of this over and over again. It just looks like something else is being addressed, but it's basically reiterating the same construct. And so, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Wilt and law are essentially the same. Love is the law. Love and law are essentially the same. And I'm talking about in terms of etymology, and love and will are the same. And so this individual is just repeating this whole thing. Now we're going to look at some aspects of scripture that address this whole will desire dynamic. And we've actually addressed these before with respect to a different conversation. Now, this word desire is found in scripture under the word ava. And you see this in Strong's from 183 through 185. And so when you look at ava or aya, you will see this idea of desire, crave, and covet. And there are similar constructs in the New Testament for to desire, to crave, to long for, to wish for. And so those are other constructs that go along with this idea of desire and crave, long for and wish for. You can find these entries in the Greek 1937 and 3713. This was a very interesting aspect of this ava. There was another understanding of ava presented, and it relates to sign, to mark, describe with a mark, to mark out, to measure. This is interesting because with respect to psychopathy, individuals are singled out or they are targeted by the individual who is operating in a psychopathic manner. They are singled out for what it is the individual believes they can get from that individual. And so they are measured up in order to determine what they can get that is needed or desired or willed. And so for one individual, it might be that they can get some sort of emotional resource from them. And that can come in many different ways, and it might have many different meanings for the individual. Some other individuals might be a cognitive resource. Another individual might be a financial resource. Another individual might be someone who's going to provide them with what's known as narcissistic supply. So it could be an attention resource. And so these resources can be coming from different people, coming from different directions. But with respect to this desire, there is, again, this measuring people, measuring situations to determine what can be gained from the situation. Remember, this is about that craving and coveting. So what can be gained? And here you can see that Thelema in the Greek at 2307. And so it indicates here that this is about will, desire, and purpose. And it's coming from another construct, a verb, thelo. And this is interesting because it also seems to relate to the name, the character Othello. In scripture, there is the referencing of God's will or sort of divine will with respect to this Thelema concept. However, it's not limited to that. And so there is a focus just generally on will, desire, and wishes. And here we have this Thello at 2309, and it's indicating here that it is about desire, to be disposed toward, intention. Okay. Also, this idea of wishing, again, to be inclined to something in which there is delight or desire. And here you see the construct of love in the midst of all of this. And so here we are talking about psychopathy and all of the challenges that are associated with it. But this idea of will and love are tied together, not just in terms of etymology, but in terms of general definition. And here you have part of that root of the construct of boule. And it indicates here that this is about to will, to wish, to desire, to intend. This also adds a couple of other factors with respect to not only having drive and intention, but planning associated with such. And so creating a plan in order to achieve whatever it is that is desired to address that void and that chasm. Something else to consider with respect to chasm and void is that chasm and void tend to be associated with the idea of chaos. And so that's another way of thinking about what might be going on internally with individuals who are functioning from a psychopathic perspective. There apparently is significant chaos going on, even if the individual is not conscious of the chaos. The behavioral manifestations indicate the chaos. And so here we see at 10:12, this is still in the Greek, boule, counsel, purpose, will, and plan, going back to that whole dynamic of planning. And so this idea of deliberate wisdom, but again, going right back to the construct of to will and to wish. And again, with respect to this deliberate planning, there is a reference back to this idea of divine will. And down below, you can see various transliterations for this particular construct. This takes us in another direction related to this idea of do as thou wilt. And it takes us to Strong's 1942, and this is that hava. And we've looked at this before. So in 1942, hava is mischief, calamity, desire, and ruin. The idea behind this is that oftentimes inordinate desire can lead to, or may lead to, will lead to mischief. And that's what you see with respect to psychopathic functioning, significant mischief, calamity, that's that chaos, and ruin. Again, the individual who is operating in this manner may not have a sense of ruin going on for self. However, those who are engaged with the individual, that have the individual as a part of their ecosystem, those individuals will experience that mischief as calamity and ruin. And it indicates here the term can also imply a longing or desire that leads to ruinous consequences. Remember that behavioral disinhibition. Okay, so that's a part of psychopathy, being disinhibited behaviorally, not feeling limits on behavior, and then again, not feeling remorse or guilt or general empathy when lines have been crossed. However, that may not apply to when their lines have been crossed, because when their lines have been crossed, there is a tendency to quickly get in touch with whatever the feelings are associated with the violation in terms of the lines. But with respect to other people, and even for the individual, these desires, this doing as thou wilt, can often have ruinous consequences, not only for the self, but for all of the people around the self. And also recall that this hava is in some way associated with Eve, but most importantly, it is associated with a deity. Okay, so Old Testament deity. It indicates here also that hava is desire, chasm, and destruction. Chasm is also a construct that is associated with destruction. And so it goes on to indicate hava is calamities, craving, deadly, desire, destruction, destructive, and greed. And that's that coveting. Coveting is where someone wants something that they don't have that often, of course, belongs to someone else. And it could be anything. It doesn't have to be material things. It can be, again, those emotional dynamics, cognitive dynamics. It can be a number of factors. Now, many individuals who are operating in a psychopathic manner will deny feeling an experience of emptiness. However, individuals only crave when something is missing. When individuals are filled up, there is no longer a craving. And so, with respect to the do as thou wilt, there is an incessant craving going on. And again, it could be cravings for a number of things, but that void is there, that chasm is there, and it's just often very difficult to fill it up. There's always something that is being pursued, something that is desired, a constant state in many ways of dissatisfaction. Now, some people might disagree with that. However, one would need to reconcile this incessant, inordinate desire that is going on and this inordinate focus on doing as thou wilt. And here you see discussion that goes right to the heart of some of the things that we are talking about. And so you see, with respect to this hava, we have that calamity, but we also have iniquity, mischief again, a mischievous thing, naughtiness, a perverse thing. And so these are some of the dynamics that go along with that whole construct of do as thou wilt. There will be problems associated with doing as thou wilt without concern for the implications for other people, without concerns for bad outcomes in terms of the environment. And so here you see this hava construct that is basically a stand-in for what takes place with respect to psychopathy. Now, there is something to be said for choosing a name wisely, and this is probably one of those bad name choices. And so here we have in Strong's at 1943, Hova. And we've discussed this before again with respect to deity dynamic. And Hova means ruin, disaster, and mischief. This again is coming from that whole idea of desire and inclination, also referring to the idea of being or existing and falling. And here you see this interesting relationship that was mentioned earlier. So at 160 in the Hebrew, you see Ahaba. But interestingly, this is not really pronounced Ahaba. It has that betacism going on, and the actual pronunciation is Ahava or Ahaya. Okay? And so this is a word for love. And you can see that this is derived from the root ahav. And yes, this is associated with hava. And this discussion points out something very important. It mentions that ahab or ahav relates to affection, but it gives a clarification and indicates that this can be in a good or a bad sense. And another interesting side note here is that this Ahava or Ahawa is a river of Babylonia. Now, in addition to the psychological dynamics related to psychopathy, the philosophical dynamics associated with psychopathy, and the theological findings that we have related to psychopathy, we have these symbolic factors. What's interesting to note about psychopathy and some of the other things that we've been talking about is the animal associations related to psychopathy. There are 3 animals that tend to be related to psychopathy, 2 more than the other, and then 1 is primary. And so a snake is one animal that is associated with psychopathy. Think of snake in the grass. A lion is another one in terms of being ferocious. However, the main animal associated with psychopathy is the wolf. This is noteworthy for a number of reasons. First of all, the individual who is operating in a psychopathic manner is often represented as a wolf in sheep's clothing. And so therefore there is a cover. They are pretending to be something other than what they are. They are pretending to be benign. They are pretending to be harmless, when in fact they are voracious and predacious. Okay. And so this is important for another reason. This word wolf, when you look at the etymology of it, interestingly, and we've talked a little bit about this, it is going back to this idea of a lupus. That's actually another name for wolf. This lupo and lubo. Oddly, the word love also has the same etymology root. And so essentially, when you go back into the construct of love, you find yourself at lupo and lubo. And so essentially meaning wolf. And this is likely tied to the whole idea of desire and longing, and pursuing and things like that. But with respect to this animal dynamic, this is important to keep in mind. And so when individuals are thinking about how they can help treat an individual with psychopathy, or how they can help heal the individual or make the relationship better, it's important to keep in mind that there is that wolf characteristic going on with respect to individuals who are operating in this manner. So again, we are talking about intra-species predation, and we are talking about voraciousness with respect to the predation. Now, with respect to this topic or these topics, you are free to ask questions. And what I will do is I will work to answer whatever questions that you present related to this particular topic as we go along. Thank you for joining us. This is going to wrap up this part of this discussion.